I think back to the old days when we didn't have the internet, the only thing about security we were concerned about were viruses coming off of floppy disks. Well, once the internet came around and was adopted widely, it really opened up a window into our businesses and our homes. We've got Guy Huntington from Training in a Flash. Brought you on just to kind of give us an idea of what businesses and people at home as well can do to make sure that they have a more secure environment for not only their computers but all the information that are stored on these systems now. Maybe we can just talk about some of the statistics, like what's happening out there. How bad of a threat is this now?
Right. So let's just talk about the general public first before we get into businesses. So about 1 in 4 of all computers attached to the internet are contaminated with what we call malicious software, which we call malware. And that malware can infect your computer, and it can actually take control of the computer unbeknownst to you. And it can actually steal your identity as well as your bank information, etc. So that represents about 150 million to 200 million computers out there who are now lost control of their computers and they don't know it. Then the next thing is that phishing attacks, which is quite common right now for banks and also for large enterprises like eBay and that. There was 55,000 new phishing sites last month alone.
55,000 sites.
55,000 new sites. Okay. Then we have Google, who just recently released a study just this last week, and they said that about 10% of all web pages on the internet contain malicious software. That means you go to a site anywhere on the internet, about 1 in 10 of them has software now that will, unbeknownst to you while you're on the site, will creep into your computer and will infect it. And that then means you're at risk of losing your identity information, even worse, what's on your computer, and even worse than that is your financial information.
Well, it is serious when you talk about 1 in 4 computers. Like you said, I think most people aren't aware that their computer is infected and they can't really find out. Even if they're running things like antivirus software, it doesn't pick it up.
Right, so that's the next thing. So now on a good month right now, there's about 200,000 new types of viruses predicted for 2007, 200,000. And about, on a good month, the antivirus vendors, it doesn't matter the vendor, will pick up between 70 and 80% of the viruses. That means that you're at risk on a good month with a good vendor of about 30% of those attacks successfully penetrating your antivirus solution.
Kind of makes me want to turn my computer off and get disconnected from the internet.
Well, it's like the Wild West, and
yep.
So now you have to go carefully, whereas before we were just all taking to the internet, doing our banking online, and we were just sort of thinking it was going to happen to somebody else. But nowadays you have to be much more aware of the dangers. And if you go about it properly, like looking across the street before you walk across, you can do things safely on the internet, but you have to be heads up.
Well, let's talk about that, because most of us, we load on our antivirus software, maybe a software firewall, and we've got a router that's got a firewall. That's not always enough.
Right, so let's sort of start, let me sort of go over the basic steps that an average home person has to do, and then we'll talk about businesses.
Sure.
So an average home person, the first thing they should do is make sure that they have an up-to-date copy of an antivirus software. And more than that, they should make sure that that software is being updated every day. So most people now, they have antivirus software, but most of them don't know when they're being updated. And some of them aren't updated every week, every month, every year. And the problem is that every day there's several thousand new viruses that come out. So if you're not updating every night on your computer, you're at risk of being attacked.
And viruses just don't come through email anymore.
No, they don't come through email anymore. So they come through your web browser, stuff like that. But let's just sort of take the simple crawling steps. So step number 1, make sure that you have a great antivirus software. Step number two is make sure you keep it up to date. Step number 3 is make sure you have some kind of firewall. Now, firewall can be a software, it can be a little box that actually protects your computer from attacks. So if you put a box out on the internet now, about every 15 minutes you'll have several hundred different attacks against your IP address or your computer. That's pretty scary. And it doesn't matter who you are, you don't have to be a big bank, just be a home person. You could have several hundred attacks every 15 minutes. So what that means is that you need some kind of device there that's going to prevent those kinds of attacks from creeping up through your computer lines into your computer. So step number 2 is to have a good firewall. Step number 3 is to use your head. And now this is where we come in. There's a lot of lack of security awareness out there. And so what my company is doing is we're providing security awareness training products that are free as well as paid for the general public and enterprises. And so what the basic things that we tell people are is never, ever, ever click on an email unless you know the person who sent it to you, and even more important, unless you're expecting the email. So what's happened now is that because all these computers out there are infected, it's quite easy for criminals now to gain access to your email address book. And as a result, then, they can send very legitimate-looking emails from your best friend, your business colleague, etc. And they may or may not have document attachments to it. And you should never, ever, ever click on any email link unless you are expecting that particular email. So, like my father-in-law, he sends me all these jokes all the times and that, and now I don't ever click on them because I know that those are a high-value target for bringing in malware into the computer. So you should never, ever click on emails.
Comedy has died now.
Comedy's over.
Yeah, we won't get any jokes.
Yeah, so that's the next step, is to get your alert sense up and never click on it. Now, particularly for banks. There's a study that was out by the University of Indiana just about a month or two ago, and they said that about 11% of people who receive phishing emails are going to click on it. 11%.
That's pretty high.
That's very high. So that sort of bombshelled the old number we used to think about, 3%. So it's 11% plus or minus 3%. So it could be as low as 8%, as high as 14%. So an average of 11% of people are going to click on these emails that are coming from banks and credit unions and whatever. And that is a no-no.
Crime does pay.
Crime does pay. It pays really well.
Wow.
And so you should never, ever click on any email links, especially from your banks. Now, those types of attacks are also getting more sophisticated. So now, instead of just having an email link where you click on it from your bank and it takes you to a fake bank site, we now have things called phishing attacks and faxing attacks. And what happens there is oftentimes now the criminals are sending in an email that says, call your bank, and they give you a 1-800 number. And so people think, oh, that's okay, I'm going to call the bank, so I'm not going to click on a link on an email. At that time, you call the 1-800 number, it sounds just like the bank, except it isn't. And then they ask for your PIN information, which you enter over the phone, and then the criminals have control over your bank account. So step number 3 or 4 is never, ever phone numbers that you got off an email from your bank off the internet. The other thing is that they also have faxing attacks, where now what happens is the criminals will send in a number and they'll ask you to fax in information to a fax number, and that fax number is owned by the criminals, not the bank. So these are just sort of general things that an average person can do to actually limit and mitigate their risk of a successful attack. The next thing is, this is a little more complicated, and this goes down now into the technical mumble jumble, and that has to do with your router. So most people at home now have a router, and a router is a box that allows you to hook up 2 or 3 or 4 different computers such that you can all talk to the internet at once. And the problem with the router is that there's several 100,000 or million routers that are sold every year in North America alone. And almost all of them are shipped with what we call as a default password. So if you buy a router from D-Link or Cisco or somebody like that, it's going to come with a default password.
Literally default.
Yeah, and it's what happens is that you could visit a web page on the internet. It could be any web page, and unbeknownst to you, there could be a little script that's running quietly on the web page, and it will automatically check and see if your router is using the default controller or not, the default password. If it is using that, then they think, oh, good, we can take control of your router. Now, at the moment they take control of your router, they can do really bad things to you. They can do something which we call a farming attack. And a farming attack is where you type in the name of your bank, so you go to www.mybank.com, and you expect to be directed to yourbank.com. However, what happens is in the background of the internet, there's all these mapping of mybank.com to internet numbers. And what happens with the router is it then takes control of that and actually sends you to a fake bank site, even though you've entered in the proper URL in your browser. So about 50 to 70% of all routers out there use default passwords. So this is something, if you're at home or on the plane watching this, you should think to yourself, oh my God, I better go home. I better make sure that my router is not using a default password. Because it could happen to you just by surfing around the internet, going to a web page, and unbeknownst to you, the criminals have software out there. It's these 10% of web pages that are infected, and it'll actually take control of your router.
So many things to look after, but so important that you really hit all of them. People can find out more information about security at your website?
Definitely. So we have some products, we're releasing them in a series, that actually help 2 or 3 minutes at the most to actually educate the consumer on a little bit of this technology. And that's at http://training.authenticationworld.com.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Guy Huntington talking all about security, and obviously a number of different steps, but every single one of them very important to make sure that not only your home but your business is secure.